Hey, it's Cassidy again. So sorry if I sound so congested. I've actually been sick since this new year and won't seem to go away, but today we're gonna read Not a Drop to Drink, chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11. A killing frost had fallen, turning the morning dew into a deadly covering of ice that stilled the insect voices. The sharp morning air ripped into Lynn's lungs as she zipped her overalls up to her neck. Beside her, an unrecognizable Lucy trotted loyally along, an oversized hat pulled down to her eyebrows, a scarf wrapped up to her nostrils. "What are we doing today?" Her voice was muffled by the layers of fabric Lynn had covered her with before trusting her frail skin to the outdoors. "Gotta get wood inside. You sit if your feet start hurting you." Lucy had proven less a hindrance and more of a help as the days went by. Her endless energy and curiosity could be put to good use, Lynn had soon realized. Small jobs, like gathering little bits of kindling and checking the supply of sanitized water, had soon bored her, and Lynn began trusting her with more work. Her feet were still healing from cutting out the overgrown toenails, something that had been less of a struggle than Lynn had anticipated. She'd asked Stebbs to assist, expecting crying, pleading, and a general struggle from Lucy. Her request that he hold the child down while she did the cutting had been met with a raised eyebrow and the suggestion that they try a less violent route first. After his patient, carefully worded explanation to Lucy, she had submitted gracefully to his touch, wincing and burying her head in Lynn's lap for the worst moments. There had been tears, but no wailing. The throb after the surgery Lynn had dulled with some aspirin, after struggling with the cap. It hadn't been removed in years. Lynn had debated allowing Lucy to help her haul wood in. One dropped log could send the child into a world of pain, but Lucy insisted that boredom was worse than a bloody toe, finally consenting to wearing 3 pairs of socks inside an old pair of Lynn's boots. She plodded along beside Lynn as they made their way to the pole barn, curious and comfortable. "All right," Lynn said as she shoved the rolling door open. "I've got a wagon in here you can drag around the yard, gather all the little sticks, things we can use for kindling if our coals go out downstairs." Lucy's brows knitted and she stopped in her tracks. "That's not a new job. You said you had a new job for me." You get to use the wagon now." The flash of inspiration had struck Lynn on her water-gathering chores the evening before, when she spotted her old red wagon resting in the dark corner. "That's an old job, just with a new wagon. I want to help you with the wood." "You are helping with the wood," Lynn insisted as she tugged on the handle to dislodge the wagon from its resting place. "Kindling is wood." Lucy muttered something under her breath, but it was lost inside the scarf covering her mouth. She took the handle of the wagon and trudged glumly out the door with the wagon wheels squeaking their protest. Lynn followed, warned Lucy to stay in the yard, then made her way to the wood cords on the east side of the house. They would make it through the winter. The basement retained heat well, especially once she dropped the woolen blanket that covered the entrance to the pantry room. There wouldn't be much excess firewood to rely on for next fall, which made cutting in the summer a must. How she would manage to leave the house to cut was a question she didn't have a good answer to. The pond couldn't be left unguarded. She'd probably have to trade labor with Stebbs again, and even though she didn't like the idea of needing him, the feeling of shame that usually erupted at having to ask for help had subsided a bit. Self-reliance had been Mother's mantra. Nothing was more important than themselves and their belongings. Allowing Lucy into their home had gone against everything she'd learned, but leaving the little girl to die beside the stream went against something that was simply known and had never been taught. She'd shared the thought with Stebbs after they worked on Lucy's feet. He told her it was her conscience, guiding her in the right direction. Having a conscience was a new experience, and one Lynn was starting to question as she regarded the sullen child tossing twigs into the rusty red wagon. Lucy would have to go back. Eli and Neva had shelter now. A few days ago, Lucy had come running down to the pond, the armload of sticks threatening to take an eye out if she fell. "Lynn, there's a truck coming down the road." Such a nonsensical comment had brought Lynn to her feet, sidearm in hand. They'd rushed to the roof together, Lynn impatiently smacking the little girl's backside when she'd balked 20 feet up. The sound of an engine had been noticeable on the cold morning air, and Lynn chided herself for not hearing it sooner. She'd been distracted by the looming handle of the water bucket that should be ebbing and flowing peacefully far beneath the surface of the pond, not mere inches from it. The hum of the engine grew louder, and Lynn saw that Lucy was right. There was a truck coming, Stebbs behind the wheel. As he passed, she saw that the bed held a chainsaw and raw lumber. He waved happily, throwing his arms up in mock surrender when he saw Lynn's gun. Lucy jumped up and down, waving back ecstatically. "What's he doing?" Lucy asked. "Looks like he's going to build your mama a house." Lucy stood on her tiptoes to watch as Stebbs disappeared down the road. "He's kind of like magic, isn't he?" "Yeah." Lynn had smiled a little in spite of herself. "Kinda." No amount of coercing would convince Lynn to visit the new home by the stream. "I'm sure it's great," she assured Stebbs as he regarded her over a shared supper in the basement. He'd brought beans with him and offered to help Lynn cut down the cured venison from the trees. It seemed rude to let him walk off into the cold evening without a warm supper. The venison had been frozen, but a few chunks cooked up nicely on the stove with the beans. Lucy sat on her cot, running her finger along the inside of the bean jar to get the last bits of sauce. Stebbs watched her for a second before continuing. "It's better than great. Tiny on account of we tossed it up so fast, but Eli had a good idea. There's a loft where they can sleep so they don't have to roll up their bedding every morning. Wasn't the easiest thing in the world to build, but there was some sense in it because there's not much floor space." Lynn stared moodily down at her supper. The idea of Neva and Eli snuggled together in the loft made her stomach feel funny in a way that wasn't related to hunger. "That Eli, he's a worker. Give him some food and it gets turned into pure muscle. I'm telling you, Lynn, you wouldn't recognize the boy from the first time you saw him." She grunted and studied her food. "Then I got lucky and found an old wood stove over at the junkyard. Nothing pretty, but it's not too big." He took a bite of venison, and Lynn welcomed the moment of silence while he chewed. Stebbs swallowed. Cut a hole in the roof and run some piping up there, and they were home, neat as pins. "Doesn't have a door, though. The stove, not the house. I told them they'd have to watch for sparks flying out of there till I can fix it." "Until you can fix it?" "Sure, why not?" He took another bite of meat and spoke with his mouth full. "I got nothing else to do. You're not exactly begging for help." "I don't need any." "I see that." He motioned toward the well-stocked pantry and the full clean water tank beyond that. You'll be setting even better once the little missy is off your hands." "Off my hands?" "Sure." Stebbs wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "Now that there's a real home over there with her mother in it." "Right, her mother, who hasn't asked about her once." The swelling anger in her belly took her by surprise, and she fought hard to keep her mouth tight, her tone even. "Now, how would you know that? You're not exactly the visiting type. For all you know, Neva is over there crying her eyes out over her little girl." Lynn gave him a cold stare over their empty plates. "But I bet she's not." Stebbs shot a glance over at Lucy, who was busy hitting the bean can with a stick. "No, she's not crying. But I can tell you she's not been doing so well either. Women don't always show their emotions clearly, and that one is hurting. She lost her home, husband, and brand new baby all at once. If she deals with it by sticking by the stream and sitting quiet, that's her business." Lynn's eyes narrowed. "You like her." "She's pretty," he said defensively. "Pretty useless." They glared at each other in silence for long enough for Lucy to notice the change. She kicked the can over to where they were sitting cross-legged on the floor. "What's wrong?" "Just this young lady and I here having a difference of opinion, is all," Stebbs said, rising awkwardly to his feet. "Time for me to be going, I suppose. Thanks for supper." "You brought it," Lynn said grudgingly. Happy with him or not, she wouldn't have him thanking her for his own food. Stebbs sighed and winked at Lucy. "Thanks anyway, and if you get it in your head to go over that direction, there's at least one person by the stream who I think wouldn't mind seeing you." "I can't leave the pond." Lynn ignored the reference to Eli, although a flush crept up her cheeks and she hoped wasn't obvious in the dimly lit basement. "That the problem, is it?" "I was lucky the one time. Can't count on luck." Even days after their trip to the stream to deliver Neva's baby, Lynn was haunted by what could have happened in her absence. "I won't do it again." Stebbs considered that for a moment. "All right then. What if I got them to come over here? Kind of like a homecoming party for the little one, it's time. Yeah, sure, when it's time. Time passed slowly. The days were shorter now, the sun making its arc from one horizon to the other so quickly that Lynn was hard pressed to accomplish her outdoor work in the daylight hours. Lucy was a welcome helper, and their pile of kindling near the basement window was sufficient enough for 2 winters, but Lynn didn't tell her to stop. Boredom would be the new enemy, she was well aware. The freezing air would drive them permanently indoors soon, where long hours would stretch. She stopped gathering water. Every bucketful she removed from the pond brought the handle closer to the surface. Lynn managed to convince herself that if it remained submerged, they would be fine. They were safe for the moment. The clean tank in the basement was full, as were the huge tanks in the pole barn, safe from freezing by the sheer volume. It was the future Lynn stored up against, the possibility of a snowless winter followed by a dry spring. No snow meant no runoff. Since their pond wasn't ground-fed, it relied on rain and runoff for refilling. There had been no rain for weeks. Lynn shut the barn door behind her, drinking in the smells for the last time in a long time. The basement tank held 1,000 gallons. With her routine at an end, she might not be back to the barn for refreshers on the basement tank for a month. Lynn snapped the double padlocks onto the pole barn door, typically Mother's last act before giving into the relentless push of winter. A spasm of grief twisted her gut, and she missed Mother desperately. It was so much easier when someone was there to tell her what to do, how to survive. Now she was on her own, with responsibilities she hadn't asked for. Lucy responded well to the cold weather, bundling up in layers of Lynn's old clothes and running for hours up through the tall grass, enjoying the sound of the brittle stalks breaking under her feet. Soon she had a meandering maze of a trail pounded through the unkempt yard, which Lynn could see clearly from the roof. Lucy played for hours with Red Dog, building him little houses out of sticks and destroying them with imaginary natural disasters. She wanted to simulate a flood, but Lynn wouldn't loan her the water. She settled for tornadoes and blew herself red in the face. She was destroying his 3rd home of the week when a flash of movement to the east caught Lynn's eye. "Lucy, to the house!" The little girl jumped to her feet and ran for cover without question. Lynn peered through her scope, but saw nothing. Wildlife had begun to return to the field where she'd slaughtered the coyotes, but she hadn't seen any more of them lately. She followed the path of the road with her scope, willing the tall grass to part and give her a clear view. A breeze stuck through the weeds and spread them far enough for her to see an unnatural shade of blue moving toward the house. Lynn's heart skipped a beat. Her rifle barrel jumped. Strangers who walked the open road were dangerous. Mother had taught her that those who didn't hide themselves believed they were the ones to be feared and were best dropped at a distance. Her finger clutched the trigger impulsively, but she let out a slow breath. The man had moved out of her sight behind the overgrowth of the ditch, but the breeze brought an alien sound to her ears. Whistling. "Can I come out now?" Lucy's hesitant voice rose up from under the eaves. Lynn stared and lost her grip on the rifle. Lynn started and lost her grip on the rifle. The sweaty barrel struck the shingles and she reflexively covered her ears. But it didn't go off. "Lucy," she hissed, "go in the house." Lynn wiped her hands on her coat and repositioned the rifle. She didn't hear the back door opening. "Lucy," she growled, a little louder. "Inside. Now." Silence met her demand and a dark dread billowed in her stomach. "Lucy? Who's making a song?" The little voice sounded curious. You don't do that. Wait, you don't do that." Lynn was off her elbows and down the antenna in a moment, rifle clutched in the crook of her arm. Keeping the man in her sights and her aim steady was impossible with Lucy standing in the open, every step bringing the stranger closer to spotting her. She grabbed the little girl by the elbow and yanked her inside, Red Dog trailing from her other hand. When she turned right at the landing instead of heading down the stairs, Lucy quit protesting and clutched to Lynn in return, the strangeness of going into the upper levels of the house quieting her. Lynn headed for the living room, where the 2 front windows looked out onto the road only 10 feet away. She silently raised the window enough to slide her rifle barrel under. Lucy crouched beside her, eyes wide. The whistling was much louder now. He came into view slowly, hobbling on bare feet over the patchy gravel road, hands jammed into his pockets against the slight chill of the breeze. Lynn could see the stark outlines of his meager muscles under the thin covering of his goose-bumped skin. Still he whistled, each shuffling step falling in time with the tune he forced between his teeth, though it seemed it was a struggle even to breathe. Lynn took her own breath, exhaled part way, and stilled her chest, eye to the scope. Suddenly she was very conscious of Lucy's hand on her arm, the warmth of each tiny finger seeping into her skin. "He looks lonely," the little girl said, and Lynn let out the rest of her breath in a rush, pulling away from the scope. "Of course he's lonely," she snapped. "He's alone. Now I need you to be quiet and not touch me for a minute." Lucy's grip on Lynn's arm tightened. "You're not going to shoot him, are you?" "I—" Lynn looked down at Lucy, her blue eyes wide and questioning, red dog tucked protectively under her elbow. "This is what I do, Lucy," she said softly. "This is how I keep us safe." "But he didn't hurt us," Lucy said, bewilderment bringing her fine eyebrows together over her tiny nose. "He hasn't done anything wrong. We don't know that." Lucy's lower lip stuck out in an expression Lynn knew all too well. "Then ask him." "What?" "I'm not letting you shoot him till you know he's a bad man." "You're kidding." Lucy crossed her arms and raised one eyebrow imperiously at Lynn, the strongest echo of Neva she'd seen in the child yet. The whistling had stopped. Lynn glanced over at the window and saw that the stranger was standing directly in front of the house, his gaze riveted on the freshly cut wood pile. "Looks like he knows we're in here already," she said. "You stay inside." Lynn tapped her finger on the end of Lucy's nose with every syllable for emphasis. The front door hadn't been opened in years, and the hinges groaned as she pulled it inward, heart in her throat. The porch was covered with piles of rotting leaves, years of debris left to decay. Lynn stepped around them, her attention hooked on the stranger's face. He'd jumped up the sound of the door, but now stood hunched against the chill, eyes weary and trained on her rifle. Her stomach clenched in apprehension before she spoke, every muscle in her body straining to stop her tongue from breaking Mother's rules. "Where are you headed?" He looked away from the gun and up to her face, then jerked his head to the west. "That way, I suppose," he said. Lynn licked her lips to hide her irritation. "Why that way is what I'm asking, and I think you know it." A small smile played with the man's lips, and she noticed that though his face had fine lines on it, like Stebb's, his hair was solid brown with no traces of gray. "I'm headed that way because it's the opposite of the direction I come from," he said, "and I'm in a hurry to get away from there." Lynn checked her grip on the rifle and took a step closer. "Where are your shoes?" "They took 'em," he said briefly, and Lynn saw his eyes dart over her shoulder, drawn to the window by some movement of Lucy's. "You alone here, girl?" No, she said. "My father lives here with me." "But he sends you out to investigate strange men?" "I'm the better shot." The man's eyes went to her hands on the gun, sure and confident. "I believe ya." They watched each other wearily for a moment, and the wind gusted, making him jam his hands farther into his pockets and turn away from the breeze. "Who is it that took your shoes? Another wanderer?" "I'm no wanderer. At least, I wasn't until a few days ago. I was set up nice, just like you." Lynn's eyes cut to the bloody gashes on his feet, the dirt packed in between his toes. "So what happened?" "It was all taken from me in the night." He looked back to the geese as he spoke, as if the words could conjure those who had harmed him. Sorry. "A truckload of men came up on me, took my gun, coat, shoes, anything in the house they thought they could use, and some stuff there's not been a need for since I don't know when. They loaded it all up and left me smelling their exhaust." "You couldn't stay and make a go of it?" He shook his head and looked at the ground. "All I had left was the roof over my head, and there's plenty of those still standing. Thought I'd find something else, maybe a house with some wood already cut and left behind. A few tin cans hanging around in the cupboards." "Don't be thinking because I asked your story I'm interested in being a part of it," Lynn said coldly. The man put his hands in the air. "Didn't mean nothing by it. You can see I'm in no shape to be taking anything from anybody." "All right, then." Lynn said, backing away from him with her gun slightly raised. I'm going to walk back inside the house here, and I want you to sit tight. Stand tight, you mean? She saw another flicker of a smile, and she fought down the urge to smile back at her own mistake. Whichever, she said, no trace of her stifled humor showing in her voice. I'll be back shortly. Lynn ducked inside the house and shoved the door closed. Lucy, she whispered, run down to the basement and get my mother's boots and coat. The ones by my cot? Yeah, go grab 'em. Hurry, while I keep an eye on him. Lucy scrambled off, evidently believing that Lynn's good humor could evaporate at any moment. She returned slightly breathless and buried underneath the quilted dark blue coat that Mother had always worn, the boots dangling from one hand. Lynn took them from her without a word, ignoring the quick puff of air that still smelled of Mother. When she pulled the door open, the stranger was cowering against the chill, the veins in his arms flat blue lines. Lynn walked to the edge of the porch and tossed Mother's boots and coat into the wind, the right boot pinwheeling over the left and landing at his feet. My mother wasn't a large woman, but you're not that big of a guy. It might be a fit, she said, her mouth clamped tightly against the emotions that welled in her throat, threatening to break through and send her running off after the coat, an object that was so entwined with the thought of Mother she could hardly picture her without seeing it. The man bent down cautiously, watching Lynn as if waiting for some trick to be played. She remained still, gun pointed downward, and he grunted appreciatively when a pair of balled-up socks rolled out of one of the boots. The coat was snug through the shoulders, but the sleeves were the right length. He sat down to lace up the boots, and Lynn felt a pang of protectiveness shoot through her at the sight of an adult going through Lucy's morning ritual, although his hands were numb from the cold and somewhat less sure than her nimble fingers. Lynn cleared her throat when he stood up experimentally. They fit? They do, and I thank you, he said, clear eyes connecting with hers and holding her gaze for the first time. You probably saved my life. I owe a few. He nodded once as if he understood and looked back to the east. Whether you're alone or not, you be careful, girl, you hear? Those men took everything from me, and they'll take that and a bit more from you, understand? I can take care of myself, Lynn said. You best be on your way now. Good luck to you, then, he said, and gave her a two-fingered wave and went west, his boots making a scuffing noise against the gravel as he adjusted to walking in shoes again. Lynn went inside and crouched by the window with Lucy, who wordlessly tucked herself into the curve of Lynn's body. Lynn wrapped her arms around the little girl, allowing her warmth to flow up her arms and into her chest, where her heart still ached for the loss of Mother. Lucy tilted her head against the window to watch the stranger go by, her breath making a fog against the cold glass until they could see him no more. Good luck, mister, she said, her words filled with the hope of a child. Chapter 12. A few days later, the grim specter of the traveler still haunted Lynn. If there were truly people hunting possessions down, her house would be a prime target. The stranger had faded from Lucy's mind, though, her quick, happy thoughts soon overwhelming any reminder of the despair of their world. Lynn's long journeys to the roof held no interest for the girl, and the games she'd been playing with Red Dog had lost their appeal. Lynn, her high-pitched voice carried up to the roof easily in the cool fall air. I'm bored. Lynn pulled her eye away from the scope. Read a book or something. I can't read on my own, dummy. And all you have is big, stinky poetry books. No pictures. There's a set of encyclopedias. They've got pictures, Lynn argued, but that was answered with what could only be categorized as a butt noise, followed by giggling. Can I go see Stebbs? No, you're not crossing the field alone. Then you come with me. Lynn sighed and put the rifle down. Lucy had walked out into the yard far enough that she could see her from the roof. She looked down at the petulant face. I've told you, I can't leave the pond, especially with what that guy said the other day. There's people out there looking and taking. Lynn heard Lucy whacking at some of the dead weeds for a few minutes before heaving a deep sigh. But I miss Stebbs, she argued as if they'd never stopped talking. We haven't seen him in a long time. Even though she was exaggerating, Lynn's brow furrowed. She'd spent most of the last few days on the roof looking out for Lucy while she played, watching the smoke rise from the streamer's new home, on alert for threats from the south. She hadn't been watching for Stebbs, but she hadn't noticed movement in his direction either. Lynn scoured her memory to see if the familiar red flash of his handkerchief had become so commonplace she'd ceased to notice it, or if she truly hadn't seen it in days. She brought her eye back down to the scope, focusing on Stebb's small shelter tucked away in the woods. It was much easier to spot now that the leaves were off the trees, the undergrowth of the woods stripped bare by foraging animals. There was no smoke rising from his building. Lynn set down the rifle and grabbed the binoculars, feeling intrusive as she zeroed in on his house. The binoculars brought it into closer detail and movement grabbed her attention. His front door was banging open and shut in the wind. The wrongness of the image made her stomach drop. Stebbs was so far removed from the road she hadn't thought to warn him about the stranger's news of men in trucks. "Lucy, do you have good boots on?" "Yeah." Lynn strapped the rifle across her back. "We're going for a walk." The field was difficult to navigate. The frozen clumps of dirt kept tripping Lucy up, and the bleach-white skeletons of the coyotes fascinated her. Her endless curiosity brought the expected flow of questions, but Lynn remained silent about the piles of bones. She kept one hand on Lucy, the other resting on the butt of the handgun stuffed in her waistband. She didn't like being away from the pond, but she couldn't ignore the fact that Stebbs would never have left his front door open in winter. Something was wrong, and her newly found conscience wouldn't let her ignore it. "All right," she said to Lucy once they were on the edge of the woods. "I want you to stay right here until I say you can come in." "Why?" "Because I don't know what happened. There could be bad people in there, or something you shouldn't see." Fear made the little hand clench hers tighter. "Bad people like the ones that took that guy's shoes?" "Just like those." "Don't leave me here alone." Lynn wrenched her hand away from the girl's, ignoring the stab of guilt when her lower lip trembled. "You're safer here. Sit tight. You'll be able to see me the whole time, and I'll be able to see you. Once I know it's safe, you can come in." "Okay," Lucy said doubtfully, but she sat on the ground. Lynn approached Stebb's shelter wearily. She'd never been in his woods. The only houses she'd ever walked into were the ones she already knew were empty. Stebb's shelter was a converted shed that had been standing when the ancient brick house that accompanied it had crumbled. Lynn skirted the pile of crumbled bricks as she approached the shed, gun in hand. She stuck her foot out to stop the door from banging against the side of the building and peered around the doorframe. There was no one inside. A small stove rested in the corner, cold and empty. There was a window facing east, with a small shelf above it that held one plate, one fork, one spoon, and one cup. That was all. The only luxury Stebbs had was a real bed pressed up against the west wall. It was small, but with a true mattress. Lined up beside the door were 3 pairs of boots, the right heel worn much lower than the left on all of them. His coat hung limply from a nail by the door. But Stebbs wasn't there. Lynn stuck her head out the door and called for Lucy, who came crashing through the undergrowth. "Where's he at? Where's the magic man?" Lynn sat on the bed, relishing the comfort of the mattress even though her mind was enveloped in worry. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe he went to see my mama and Eli." "Maybe," Lynn said, only to comfort the girl. Dead leaves were skittering around the floor of the shed in the breeze. The door had been open for a few days at least. Lucy stood on tiptoe to glance onto the shelf above the window. "So where's his food? Where's his water?" "What's that?" "We've got all our food and water right where we can get it. Where's his?" Lynn jumped to her feet and kissed the little girl on the head. "Thanks," she said. "You're a genius." Lucy's nose scrunched up. "Huh?" Lynn swept back the braided rug beside the bed to find a carefully cut trapdoor that opened on well-oiled, silent hinges. A weak voice rose up from the dark depths below. "I'm flattered you came to check on me." The ladder that led down into Stebb's underground storage space had broken under his weight when he'd gone to retrieve his supper 2 days before. His ankle had twisted underneath him badly enough that he couldn't walk, but he'd been in no real danger. The walls of the little bunker held canned food, vegetables, even a camp toilet. His plan had been to wait until his good ankle supported him well enough to pull himself up through the trapdoor, but Lynn and Lucy were a welcome rescue party. He handed pieces of the broken ladder up to Lynn, who tossed them aside. We've got plenty of ladders back in the pole barn. She called into the darkness of the hole. I'll go back and get you one. We can get you out easy. How long of one do you need? Lynn flicked on the flashlight he'd been carrying with him when he'd fallen. The light swept up the earthen wall so that Lynn could see for herself. I'd say, what, 10 feet? She called down. Should do it, came the agreement. You sure you're okay? I'm fine. It was just a fall. I'll be right back with the ladder. She called to reassure him. Lucy tugged on her sleeve. Can I stay here? Lynn looked at her for a second, considering. Lucy's little nose was red from the frigid air that had bitten out their skin as they crossed the field, her lips chapped. Yeah, sure, I guess. Her eyes swept to the cold stove. Go out into the woods and get kindling, just like at home, okay? When I get back, we'll get a fire started so that it's warm for Stebbs once we get him up. Don't go far while you're looking, though, and don't do anything stupid like sing. Lucy took her instructions seriously. Lynn could hear the little girl moving through the dead brush as she walked away, but just barely. She stifled a flash of pride. It's not like she's yours or anything, she reminded herself out loud as she crossed the field toward home. Lynn chose one of her shorter wooden ladders and headed back over the field with it across her shoulders, both arms draped through the rungs. She felt awkward and vulnerable. If there was a threat, animal or otherwise, she'd never be able to disentangle her arms from it in time to defend herself. She cast a glance backward at her house in the pond as she crossed the field. Already they'd been away longer than she was comfortable with. She called out to Lucy when she approached the house, and the door was open for her. They slid the ladder down into the hole, and Stebbs flicked the light on so they could see as they descended. Lucy insisted on coming down with Lynn, exhilarated at the thought of exploring Stebbs' hiding place. Stebbs was sitting on the earthen floor, one leg folded under him, the other stretched out straight, with the foot propped on top of a bucket. Looks comfortable, Lynn said, brushing dirt from her front. He grimaced. It's not the best, but it keeps the swelling down. Pretty nice setup you've got here, she said as her gaze swept the room. She could only see within the range of his flashlight, but even in that small area, there was enough canned food to last 2 winters. She heard a scurrying in one of the dark corners. Lucy, is that you? Check this out, the little voice answered, followed by a metallic click, the sound of rushing water, and a yelp. Lucy, stop! Stebbs shushed her with a hand. It's okay, he said. Push that handle back down, Lucy. Lynn heard the metallic noise again, and the sound of rushing water stopped. Stebbs' light jumped to the corner where Lucy stood next to a spigot, looking sheepish. Lynn grabbed the light from Stebbs and walked over to it, cupping her hand under her mouth to catch a few drops that fell from it. She raised it to her lips. Fresh water, cold and clear. How the hell did you get lucky enough to find a well? Stebbs was quiet for a moment, and Lynn switched the light back in his direction. I witched it, he finally said. Bullshit. Lynn's voice came out strong, but the beam of the flashlight shook. What's witched mean? Lucy asked. Like he really is a magic man? Lynn and Stebbs regarded each other quietly before she answered the little girl. He might as well be. They got Stebbs up the ladder and into his bed, with his foot propped under his balled-up coat. Lucy was thirsty, so he gave her the flashlight and his cup off the shelf, and showed her how to close the trap door from the inside, as well as how to pull the rug back over it using a string he tied to one end that dangled down onto an underground room. They could hear her banging around happily underneath them while they looked at each other. I always wondered where you got your water, Lynn said eventually. I never saw you gathering any. No need to, he answered. It's always right there, fresh and for the taking. How deep is it? I only dug down 15 feet or so before hitting it. I reinforced the sides before dropping the pipeline, but really there was no work to it. Sorry, can't get the page. Will it ever run dry? Stebbs shook his head. Not once. You know how those veins are, though, persnickety as hell. With only one man drawing off it, I do okay. But these same little sources feed places like the creek. You and I both know exactly how dependable that is. Still, it was wonderful. His water source was always at arm's reach and deep enough that he had no need to purify for fear of human contamination. Anyone looking at his tiny shelter wouldn't think he had anything worth taking, unaware that a gold mine lay underneath. Lynn's large house, outbuildings, and obvious pond made her a constant target. There was a thump as the trapdoor opened and Lucy's head emerged. Her face was filthy, her hair covered in cobwebs. "That's the coolest place ever." "That place is a super secret special place. Do you understand?" Lynn asked. Lucy nodded solemnly. If the bad people knew that Stubbs had that place in his house, they would come and take it from him. "They're mean," Lucy said, making a face. "Very mean," Stubbs agreed. "It's important that you not talk about it, okay? Especially the part about how I can find water." "You mean that you're a witch?" "Yes, that is a very, very big secret," Stubbs said, and Lucy looked up from him to Lynn, frightened. "He's not a witch in the way you're thinking of it, Lucy," Lynn explained. "He can find water under the ground. It's called water witching." There's water under the ground?" "Yeah, come here." Stubbs motioned to Lucy, and she approached the bed. He held out his chapped hand. Dark blue veins rose prominently over his knuckle bones. "You see that?" he asked, pointing to them. "There's veins down under the ground like these that are in our bodies, except they're full of water, not blood. The ground is like the skin here on our bones, keeps the water down inside. I can find that water without seeing it, and then I dig where it's at to make a well." "How do you do it?" "Lynn, go outside to that witch hazel and cut me a forked switch." "You're not serious," she said. "You're giving a demonstration?" "The least I can do is provide some entertainment for my rescue party." Lynn bit down on her retort and went out into the waning light to cut the switch with her pocket knife. When she came back, Lucy had 3 piles of blankets on the floor beside the bed, and Stubbs was sitting up. She handed him the forked switch. "All right, now, close your eyes," Lucy said. "No cheating." Stubbs obeyed, and Lucy slid the cup of water under the middle blanket. "Ready," she said, and scurried over beside Lynn to watch. Stubbs pulled himself to the edge of the bed, held the forked ends of the switch loosely in his hands with his palms up, and swept the other end over the blanket slowly, starting on the right. He'd barely passed over the middle blanket when the stick turned in his hands, jabbing downward at the cup of water hidden underneath. "Am I right?" Stubbs asked Lucy, even though Lynn could tell from his eyes that he knew he was. Lucy bolted up from the ground. "That is so cool," she shouted, then pulled the cup of water out from under the blanket to look at it suspiciously. "Can I still drink it?" "Sure," Stubbs laughed. "How do you do that, really? Is it magic?" "No, nothing like that," he said. "It's just something I'm able to do. Sometimes it's genetic. My grandfather could do it. Some people can just feel water." "Lucy, pick up this mess," Lynn said, pointing to the blankets. She took the switch from Stubbs, forced him to lie back down on the bed, and repropped his foot. "That was stupid," she said to him. She was excited enough already, now she's going to chatter about it forever. "Who's she going to talk to? You, Eli, her mother?" "Them knowing doesn't bother me." "But the others, what if they're watching? What if they overhear her saying something to one of us? What if she slips in front of a stranger one day? I just want to make her happy. That kid's got little enough to smile about." "It's not worth it," Lynn shot back. You know what would happen to you if the wrong people found out about your house? You'd... Hey guys, look!" Lucy's cry of joy reverberated inside the small shelter. They turned to see her holding the dowsing stick expertly in her upturned palms, the long end pointing empathically at a bundle of blankets. Lynn jumped to her feet and yanked the covering away. The little cup of water that had been underneath spilled across the floor. Her gaze met Stubbs. "Shit," she said. "So I'm a water witch, too?" Lucy asked as they crossed the field by the light of the newly risen moon. "Shut up about that." Lynn turned in her tracks and thrust a finger in Lucy's face. "Remember that man on the road and those men who took his shoes? Lucy's lip quivered as she looked into Lynn's angry face. The bad men? Yeah, the bad men. What he had that was worth anything to them, he took. His wood, his food, his gun, right down to his socks. They took everything that meant anything. What you've got isn't something they can just pull out of your hands, and it's worth more than shoes. You can find water, Lucy. If anyone knew, they'd take they'd take me, the little girl said, because it's like I got the water inside me, and they can't just take it out. Yeah, Lynn said softly, shoving down the hard spike of fear that had risen in her chest. They'd take you, or Stebbs. Either one of you would be worth more than gold, but I don't think the life you'd be living would be worth shit. Lynn glanced around the field and readjusted the rifle on her back. Come on, she said tersely, jerking the little girl by the arm. We've been gone too long already, and stop talking. Lucy was silent the rest of the way home, and Lynn regretted speaking so harshly to her. Fear had fueled her tone, but there was no way to explain to Lucy the wave of panic that swept over her, even in daylight, when seconds passed between Lynn calling out and Lucy answering. In the dark field, it felt to Lynn like predators would see Lucy not only as the easiest target, but also as Lynn's weakness as well. She hoped Lucy would find the affection coursing through her fingers, even though the grip on her tiny wrist was iron. Lucy gathered courage to speak again once they were both tucked into the warm safety of their own cots. How bad's his ankle? What? Stebbs' foot. Is he going to be okay? He'll be fine, Lynn answered. It was just a bad sprain. He couldn't stand to pull himself out of the bunker because his other foot was lame. He'll be okay though. Like to come over and see us again sometime? Lynn found herself smiling in the dark. She wasn't the only one who found Stebbs' company comforting. I doubt we can keep him away. Lynn was quiet for a moment, but it was a heavy silence. Oh, I bet my grandma could have fixed up his foot nice. Lynn turned in her cot. She could barely make out the pale moon of the little girl's face on the other side of the basement. Your grandma? She's a doctor back in the city. Said she'd come and find us when she could get away. I thought maybe she could fix Stebbs' foot, make my mommy better too. Your grandma is a doctor? Yeah, she's important in the city. Has a big office in the hospital and all that. I got to visit her there once, and I wanted to see the babies, but they don't let her near that part of the hospital. So she's not a baby doctor? No, just a sick people doctor. It'd be nice to have one of those around here. She said she's coming, Lucy said quickly, as if her saying so would make it true. Soon as she could get away, she said she'd follow us. She said Neva's her little girl, and she won't be away from her, no matter what. Follow you how, Lucy? It didn't seem like you guys even knew where you were going. A long silence followed, and when she spoke, Lucy's voice shook. My dad saw you on the water map. What? Lynn sat up in her cot, alarm spreading through her body. What do you mean, a water map? He saw me? I'm not supposed to talk about it. Lynn folded up into the fetal position on her cot. It's a bigger secret even than Stebbs and me being witches. No, Lucy, Lynn said as calmly as possible. I think you should tell me. I need to know what you're saying about a water map. This is important. I know it's important. All the secrets are. Geez, little girl, how many do you have? A lot. Lucy's voice cracked, and she started to cry. I've got a lot of secrets. Lynn got out of her cot and headed over to Lucy's to cradle the little head in her lap, a feral wave of protective instinct overwhelming her at the touch of the tiny skull. It's okay, kiddo, she said. You don't have to tell me all of them, but I want to know about this water map. Lucy wiped the tears from her face while she looked for a way to explain. Do you know what a computer is? I've seen dead ones in some of the houses I've been in. Never been around one that worked, though. Well, all the ones in the city work, and there's these things up in the sky called stalactites. They take pictures and give them to the computers so people can see all the land around them. People use the pictures to find water. Like my pond, Lynn said, a cold finger of fear running down her spine. Yeah, Lucy said, her voice still thick with tears. They don't let everybody see those maps, though, even in the city. Only soldiers get to look. and even then only the super special ones. Because the people who run the city, they don't want everybody who lives there coming out there to get water for themselves. Why not? Because then they won't pay for it, Lucy said simply. But my dad, he said even if they did let all the people know where the water was, nobody would be able to get to it out here because of the crazy hillbillies. He said people were better off paying for it than being shot. Lynn ignored the rush of anger. So how did your dad know about these maps? Was he one of the soldiers allowed to see them? Yeah, Mommy and Daddy got real nervous a while back, right before her belly got big. They started talking a lot after I was supposed to go to sleep. I could hear them through the door. Daddy started sneaking looks at the water maps to find somewhere for us to go. Then he'd come home and draw it out the best he could, and Uncle Eli would watch. They memorized them, then burned them up. You said your dad saw me? There was another reluctant silence. Lynn got up and opened the door to the stove and threw some wood on the glowing coals. Lucy's wet face gleamed in the firelight. "We're supposed to take your house." "Excuse me?" "Daddy said it was a good place." "It is a good place," Lynn said stiffly. "It's also mine." "He didn't know you were here," Lucy said, her face scrunching up to cry again. "Daddy didn't know there were people here." Okay, I'm sorry." Lynn crawled back onto the cot with Lucy and cradled her head once more. "So why didn't you?" "We got caught. Daddy got killed, then me and Mommy and Eli got kicked out." Uncle Eli followed the map in his head, but when he saw there was someone living at your house, he said he was too weak to take it by force. And Mommy just sat down and wouldn't go anymore. Lynn stroked Lucy's hair and thought for a moment. "Did your grandma see these maps that your dad and Eli memorized?" "Yeah, she learned them too." "It's possible, then, that she could find us." "You think so? Don't get your hopes up too far, kid, but maybe." Lucy's eyes were fluttering down towards sleep when Lynn asked her last question. You said your grandma could fix Ded's foot, and maybe your mother too. What did you mean? What's wrong with Neva?" "I don't know," Lucy answered slowly. "But when we got arrested, me and Mommy and Daddy, we were sitting in jail and some of the soldiers came and took her away. When they brought her back, she looked okay, but she was walking funny, like they hurt her somehow. Then she just curled up like I am now and wouldn't talk to me or Daddy." Lucy looked at the fire while she talked, and the flames illuminated her fresh tears. Mommy would have days like that before the jail even. Sometimes she would just say it was a bad day, and she would have to lie down or not get out of bed at all. Daddy tried to make it a good day, but usually Grandma was the only one who could help. It was worse after the soldiers came to the jail. I think maybe whatever those men did to her, it's still hurting. Maybe Grandma can make it better?" Lynn tightened her grip on the frail little body. "I don't know, kiddo. Maybe."